Hi, hello, it's me, Donald Robertson again from sunny, actually quite sunny, Nova Scotia and Canada. So welcome to week 4 of Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training. I keep thinking I'm going to get that wrong, so I was running 2 courses at the same time. The weeks were out of sync. It's week 4. So say hello and where you're watching from in the comments. I know somebody asked where my accent's from. I'm from Ayr in the west coast of Scotland, near Glasgow originally. And I lived for a long time in England. And now I'm Canadian. But originally, I'm from Old Ayr, wham ne'er a tune surpasses for honest men and bonny lasses. Neither of which is true, I think. But where are we? So as usual, the agenda, we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping, then review week 3, and then we'll do a preview of week 4. So welcome to the webinar. I hope that you're all safe and well. We're living in kind of crazy times, aren't we? We definitely need our stoicism, even more than we did last week. So housekeeping stuff. Remember to do the quizzes and do the discussions. They're really important. You'll benefit more from the course. Oh yeah, you can turn on subtitles if you can't understand my Scottish accent. You just click a button and you can turn on the subtitles. And I'm not sure if you can do that live. I think you can do that in the video afterwards, though, if you're watching the replay. Remember, you can always pause the video and resume it even during the live stream, or you can watch the recording afterwards. There are PDF downloads of each week at the beginning of the course, at the beginning of the section, the week section. And then we're going to send out the questionnaire at the end of this week. So it's really, 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 really important that you do the questionnaire. You know, like mainly if you've already if you've already done it at the beginning of the course, and then you do it again at the end. That allows us. I know it does take a few minutes or whatever, but it's usually valuable to us. And the data that we're collecting this time round will benefits the modern Stoicism movement, if that's a thing. It benefits people. I guess that's the main thing, because it allows us to clarify a really important question this time about how Stoicism works. It was a really important question last time as well, but this time we're testing something in particular. I'm trying to say as little as possible so I don't prejudice things. But the thing we're testing is really important, and potentially that information benefits people. So please take the time to fill out the questionnaire. Again, if there's any trolling or spam or anything, email us at modernstoicism.com, admin@modernstoicism.com, or via the link in the course. Always be courteous and try and be helpful towards other course participants. That's the main thing. And that's pretty much all the housekeeping, I think. I don't really have anything else to mention this week. Everything seems to be going fairly smoothly. Hi, everyone. You can hear me okay. I usually check that at the beginning. I'm guessing you can. A guy came round and fixed our Wi-Fi, so hopefully there's less buffering this week, and we should have a better signal, which is cool. And I'm glad to see the microphone is working, because like I said, I just dropped it on the floor and it's quite heavy. It's a blue, can you see that? It's a blue snowball. This is my portable version of the Blue Yeti mic. It's my setup for doing portable live streaming. So week 3 was expanding some of the concepts from week 1. It was mainly about cognitive distancing and stuff like that, bringing your attention back to the here and now. This really subtle but really important, fundamental. I think cognitive distancing, I wish we had a cooler name for it. It's also called verbal diffusion and behavioral psychology. I would say it's the fundamental psychological premise of Stoicism, basically, particularly in Epictetus. It's not events that upset us, but our opinions about them. It's absolutely fundamental to everything else. It's more important, I think, than a lot of people realise. And people sometimes don't really kind of notice how pervasive it is in the writings, particularly of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. But the concept itself, I would argue, goes all the way back to Socrates, at least. And I would say the original Socrates as well, because it's mentioned in Plato's Socratic dialogues, but also in Xenophon's Socratic dialogues in the Memorabilia Socratis several times. So that suggests that maybe it actually goes back to Socrates. And another thing that suggests that maybe it goes back to Socrates, and the Stoics knew that, is that in the most famous passage, in the Enchiridion 5, the following sentence of the same passage says, for example, if death itself were a terrible thing, it would seem so to everybody, but it did not seem so to Socrates. And this is a common strategy that the Stoics used to make people aware of the concept of cognitive distancing. They say, well, this doesn't seem the same to everybody. Therefore, it's probably your opinions that are making it seem terrible rather than the thing itself. And that argument is used by Socrates in both Plato and in Xenophon's dialogues. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Epictetus names Socrates in that same passage. But people don't usually kind of go on and quote the rest of the passage, which it's a shame. Like, it'd be good if they mentioned that more often. So that's basically, I'll read what it says about week 3. It's learning to suspend value judgments when they arise, viewing automatic thoughts with greater psychological detachment, introducing the concept of cognitive distancing. So the lesson was on that concept. The daily exercise was adapting the leaves on the stream exercise. I hope you all got on with that okay. The audio recording was the evening meditation, actually, which is kind of discussed in Seneca's On Anger, but it's also described by Epictetus. And also Galen, Marcus Aurelius' physician, describes that exercise, derived from a Pythagorean source, from the Golden Verses of Pythagoras. And we know Stoicism always had this kind of connection with Pythagoreanism. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, wrote a book called On Pythagorean Symbols, about which nothing is known except the title, but it tells us that right out of the gate the Stoics were very interested in Pythagoreanism. And the self-monitoring was rating your consistency of your the self-monitoring in week 3 was rating how much time you spend each day ruminating about unhealthy trains of thought. It's a very simple, very powerful exercise. I feel like some of the exercises we do in self-help and therapy are good but overly complicated, and when you're dealing with a very large number of people, it makes more sense to go for really kind of foolproof, simple exercises, and then you can put more effort into just kind of making sure that people get these really simple, really basic skills, because often these very simple strategies are often actually more powerful than the slightly more elaborate, the slightly harder to teach ones. And the discussion questions, what the benefits of recalling what's under your control and what isn't in difficult situations, what will be the long-term consequences of blurring this distinction, kind of doing the opposite. So that's essentially what we covered. I'm just going to have a look at some of your comments. Dangerous. We'll do this live on air. I haven't had a chance to read through them actually, but I'll go live and I'll look at what people were saying at the end of week 3. Boom. So we have comments from Anne, who's talking about listening to some of the additional material, the podcasts while walking. That's a good way if you want to kind of expand your study of Stoicism. There's loads of good podcasts and stuff. I think we threw in some links and stuff. I did so many. Like there's loads that you can download and listen to. I did 2 webinars yesterday. One of them was about Stoicism and anger. A lot of discussion about the audio recordings, particularly the week 1 one. Jesse says a benefit that I noticed when I question if an experience that I'm having is under my control is that it sort of invokes a chain reaction in my mind that leads to the image of me on a cliff looking down at the leaves of my thoughts. Oh really? Okay, so it kind of reminds you of the visual exercise, the leaves in the stream exercise. Cool. All right, okay, I'll answer the question there. Okay, this will do. So Jesse says, I'm curious though, in the week's online video, that was me, that's my fault, it was mentioned that this leaves exercise has some downsides to it. We don't know for sure, it might have downsides. There's some research and some debate about it, and the goal is actually to reach a point where you don't even need to use the exercise. It's like a boat that you use to cross a river and throw away, or a ladder or something like that. Does anyone know what are the downsides? So like, we don't really know that for sure, but there's some discussion about it between different teams of researchers at the moment. And the one issue, apart from the fact it's quite an elaborate exercise, so it uses a lot of cognitive load, and of course you'd want, as you'll see actually in the week that we're about to do, your goal is to be able to do these things like that, so that you don't have to sit down and visualize a river and all that palaver. Like, you can't walk and chew gum at the same. You can't visualize a river with leaves on it and kind of like be in the middle of a complicated conversation at the same time. That's a lot of things to be juggling in terms of your brain load, your cognitive load. So obviously you want to simplify it for that reason. But there are other issues with it. One is that it's believed that if we try to visualize elaborate things, and apart from the fact also some people might find that tricky anyway, but and then we're doing that in response to certain intrusive or automatic thoughts. It's possible that we might make those thoughts more likely to rebound in the future, to cut a really long story really short. So it's a good way of learning to get into that detached perspective. But if we make our response to automatic thoughts too elaborate, like, the concern is, which I think still has to be completely verified, that over the longer term, in some cases, that could lead to a rebound effect, or to make the thoughts more likely to recur automatically. So the jury, I think, is still kind of out on that one last time I checked. But that's the debate anyway. And what else did we do, or were we doing in the last week? That was the basic idea. Leaves in the stream exercise. The self-monitoring I talked about. This worry postponement exercise, again, it's kind of foolproof. It's really, really simple. We know, although it's a very, very powerful technique, so do it. And then that was what the audio recording was, the evening review. Okay, cool. Right, let's get into week 4. I want to spend more time discussing that this week. Cool. Oh yeah, like, if you guys and gals have achieved some results, like, it's kind of early days in a way. I mean, week 3, like 2, or I think you have to do a skill consistently, maybe every day for about 2 or 3 weeks to really give yourself a good chance of observing tangible results. And obviously there's a bunch of other variables. Sometimes you might use it depends what technique you're using, right? It depends on your personality, it depends on your situation. But broadly speaking, I'd say practicing like every day for or at least once a day for 2 or 3 weeks is a fair crack of the whip in terms of learning a psychological skill. So we're kind of getting around that point. A lot of people probably maybe haven't been quite as consistent as that, and also you've been jumping from one technique to another, hopefully giving each technique a week or more. But you might be experiencing some benefits by now, and it's fair to share those in the chat and discuss them with other participants, because that tends to motivate and inspire other people. Like, it's like this is a social learning aspect. It's one of the most powerful things, without a shadow of a doubt, is when people are in a group of ordinary people just like them, and the other people in the group say, I used this technique and this is how it benefited me. Or even more valuable in some ways is someone says, I tried to use this technique and I ran into a problem with it and this is how I overcame it. That's immensely helpful to other people in the group, actually. We know that, and experience teaches us that anyway. Right, week 4. So the intro to week 4 explains the following. I'll just tell you what it says. So week 4 consolidates your learning from the previous weeks and attempts to deepen your understanding further, obviously. It will focus on expanding your improvements across other areas of life, and also maintaining your progress over the longer term by preparing for a wide range of future challenges. So there's a kind of broadening of the scope so that your skills are applied across a wider range of situations, and in coordination with that, making it more durable and more long term. So you can think of resilience in terms of these kind of 2 dimensions. in a sense, like the improvements apply more widely and last for a longer period of time, right? There's a more detailed description that gets more into the guts of things. It says, this section mainly looks at ways to maintain your well-being in the long term by anticipating future adversity and potential setbacks and preparing yourself to cope with them resiliently. You're nearing the end of a 4-week course, but what will happen next? Are you simply going to revert back to your previous habits? Or will you take forward some aspects of what you've learned? Is Stoicism sticky? Like, will your future ways of responding be different from your responses in the past? It's time now to prepare for the future by building on what you've learned. How can you ensure that you remember the most helpful parts, address any problems or obstacles you've still got to overcome, and anticipate any potential future setbacks? Pause to consider what advice you'd give someone else who is nearing the end of this training to help ensure they continued to benefit. Do that in the chat right now, actually, you might as well. Like, what advice would you give each other? Like, right now, what advice would you give other people on this course about how they can maintain any improvements or benefits or insights that they've achieved so far and make sure that it doesn't all just get forgotten about? That's a big risk in psychological training, that people go, woohoo, this is awesome. And then like a few weeks later, they've forgotten all about it and just reverted back to what they were doing before. So we want to make Stoicism sticky. Stoicism's for life, not just for Christmas. You can tell that I've had this conversation before. The pages that follow contain some strategies derived from ancient Stoicism, combined with some very generic principles used in modern behavioural skills training. In particular, we're going to be looking at the ancient Stoic resilience building technique called premeditation of adversity, or premeditation of bad things. Premeditatio malorum, we call it. I don't call it negative visualization. That's a term that some people use. William Irvine uses that in his book. But it's all right. But I think there's a couple of things I'm not really keen on about that term. And the main one really is that it's more like visualizing indifferent things. It's visualizing stuff that people think is negative, but learning actually to view it in a more detached way and with greater indifference. So you're not visualizing. The most common problem people encounter when they're doing this exercise is that they say, well, I'm getting a bit down or I'm getting a bit anxious because I keep visualizing these negative things. And the point is that you're meant to be challenging the view that it's negative and kind of gaining cognitive distance for separating the value judgment from the thing and learning to view it as more indifferent. So you're not rehearsing viewing something as negative would be the polar opposite in a sense of what you're trying to do here. You're rehearsing viewing it as neutral and indifferent by separating your value judgment from it. That's the goal. So the term negative visualization, maybe this seems a bit pedantic, but it's just from experience. Like, you know, people tell me that when they think about it that way, they seem to be continuing to fuse the value judgment with the experience, and that's what we're trying to get away from, basically. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so the chunks of the overview that breaks down the chunks of week 4 looks like this. The lesson in week 4 focuses on general resilience building and relapse prevention, for want of a better term, or how to strengthen your Stoic mindfulness techniques in advance to face a broad range of potential future setbacks. The daily exercise is going to change from being a kind of seated meditation to be more of a rapid and frequent approach, as we call it, that requires mindfulness of yourself and your Stoic principles much more regularly throughout the course of each day, like learning to switch it on, and to do it frequently throughout the day. So rapid and frequent, right? Learning so that you don't have to sit down and visualize leaves in the stream and all that nonsense, like, so that you can just go boom, snap into like the mindset. It should only take a split second. And that you do it frequently, like, you know, that you do it as many times as you can throughout the day, so that you're kind of introducing it like a drop of dye, like boom, 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 here, here, here throughout the whole day. So hopefully it has a more pervasive effect. The audio recording is a more intensive 15-minute meditation. That's still pretty brief. On Stoic premeditation of adversity that challenges you to mindfully confront imagined future catastrophes or setbacks while rehearsing philosophical indifference. I'm going to talk a lot more about that because it's a little bit tricky, but we know it's very powerful. one of the most robustly established psychological techniques in the entire field of psychotherapy, as I like to call it. So it's a big deal, but it's easy for people to get it wrong. So simple, powerful, reliable, but just got to get the knack right. Self-monitoring this week, instead of monitoring your thoughts, actions and feelings, you're going to do it prospectively rather than kind of retrospectively, and work on developing a blueprint for future resilience, reviewing that each day, developing it, like making it ingrained in your memory, expanding your awareness of early warning signs of emotional disturbance or bad habits. And the discussion questions revolve around what would be the pros and cons of continually remembering when starting to feel distressed about a situation or event that it's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them. That's the question. So this basic concept is the concept of premeditation of adversity. It's one of my favourite concepts. Right, so let's get into it. I'm going to say that this idea in Stoicism is very obviously similar to many things that we do in modern therapy. There are a whole range of psychological techniques that are very popular, well established in modern therapy, that involve visualizing bad stuff happening. And there's many variables, this is one of my hobbies, like categorizing these techniques and playing around when experimenting with them. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do that, so let's explore that. One of the most robustly established findings in the entire field of psychotherapy research is that anxiety abates naturally through repeated prolonged exposure to the triggers under controlled conditions. What does that mean, right? What it means is, if you were a little furry animal, like millions of years ago, going through the primordial jungle, and a tree falls down, like right next to where you normally gather your mushrooms or nuts, and you freak out and panic and run away. The next day when you come back, you're probably going to be a bit nervous. You think, there was a loud noise and that scared me. It startled me. And just the startle reflex. I feel a bit nervous now going back to where I gather my nuts and stuff. So as a little furry animal, like, you'd have anxiety, like almost like a phobia. You'd develop conditioned anxiety to going back to that spot. But suppose it's all in your imagination, like the tree fell down, but it's never going to happen again, and you're perfectly safe. This would be a good place to gather nuts. So as a little furry animal, you go back, nothing bad happens. So your anxiety should, over time, begin to naturally abate. Otherwise, you'd be in big trouble. Like, it wouldn't be very adaptive of this little furry animal to go back to its nut gathering spot every day and continue to be phobic, like, even though nothing bad happens. So the anxiety has to wear off through repeated exposure under the right conditions if nothing bad happens, right? It would be weird if it didn't. And that happens in all animals as far as we know, and it happens in humans as well. So if someone has a cat phobia and you put them in a room full of cats, what reliably happens is as a simple measure of anxiety, the heart rate will approximately double within a few seconds, like almost instantly. Within a couple of seconds, the heart rate will double, as if they're running really, really hard. And then the magic question is, what happens next? Which seems like an odd question. I ask all clients with phobia that question, and they all look at me a little bit confused for a few seconds. And then eventually the penny will drop and they go, I guess eventually your heart rate would start to go down again, maybe. And they always look really doubtful about it. But I suppose it has to. What goes up must come down. And so then I'll ask them, how long do you think that would take? And they'll go, I don't know. And we don't know for sure exactly how long it's going to take, but with something like a cat phobia, it might be like 5 or 10 minutes or something like that for it to reduce to kind of begin to approach its normal resting level. Maybe, sometimes it might be 20 or 30 minutes. It varies. And if you did that, if you went into that room full of cats the next day, your heart rate would probably go up, but not as high as it did initially, and it's probably going to reduce more quickly. So it would be like, shoots up, and then it kind of goes down, goes up, down, until it gradually tails off, and you have a permanent or lasting habituation effect, as we call it. So repeated, prolonged exposure to the cat, or whatever it is that triggers the anxiety, will tend to lead to what we call emotional habituation. in psychology, like the anxiety wearing off. And that happens so reliably that in the treatment of specific phobias, the success rate in clinical trials is 90%. So it's, it's about as high as you could hope for. Some forms of anxiety are more abstract, more complex, such as social anxiety or more cognitive worrying. But basically, we've known for over half a century that that's how anxiety works. Every school child should know that. It should be in the user manual for human emotions. Right? It's a very well established thing. Freud didn't really understand that. It was kind of only really rediscovered properly in the sort of 50s, 60s. There's some precursors of that. But the Stoics seem to have known it. Aesop knew it. In Aesop's fables, he has a fable of the fox and the lion. So the fox goes into the jungle, a little bit like my furry animal. It sees a lion and it kind of freaks out. And then the next day it goes back and it feels anxious, but not as much as before. And it looks behind a bush at the lion. And then the third day it goes back and it's more relaxed. So Aesop 100% has this concept of repeated exposure leading to emotional habituation. And the Stoics have it. Now, the thing is that there are actually a bunch of other things that can go on. In addition to this emotional habituation process, there are other psychological processes. I can count maybe roughly at least half a dozen other therapeutic processes that may happen spontaneously or may happen more strategically when people are visualizing anxiety-provoking scenes. So that's something that's worth considering. But the most powerful, reliable, and important one is this basic, almost physiological mechanism of emotional habituation. So it works in anxiety, but it kind of works a bit on other emotions like anger as well. And Stoic premeditation. So like I talked about in the flesh, if there's a cat there and you're going to a room full of cats, your anxiety will wear off. Also, if you watched videos of cats, it would work, but not quite as well. Or if you just close your eyes and really visualize cats, we know that also works, but maybe not quite as well as doing it in the flesh. In therapy, we say in vivo, in the real world, versus in vitro or in the imagination. And then like things like looking at photographs or videos, I guess, would be somewhere in between. So there's so much that we could say about how this works. The main thing I'd say about it is that obviously if you pick something to visualize that's distressing, you could pick something that's kind of makes your heart rate go up 5-10 beats per minute, makes you tense up a little bit, but you can handle it, right? Or you could pick something that makes you full on panic and freak out and completely. So don't do that. So there's two variables here. One is how intense the stimulus or the stressor is, the thing that you're visualizing. So don't visualize something that's really overwhelmingly disturbing. That would, the basic question is, if it seems like it's going to be too much or it's going to be overwhelming, then pick something milder or simpler. You might push yourself when you're doing this. It would be like doing physical exercise. Don't try and run a marathon if you've never done it before, without training and practicing. You should push yourself when you're doing exercise, but not so much that you give yourself a heart attack and drop dead. And don't go over the top and do something completely ridiculous. But just try and push yourself up a little bit. Stretch yourself out a little bit within reason, and really you're the only person that can be a judge of that. The other variable would be your current state. So in the same way, if you're doing physical exercise and you're a pretty robust, healthy, young person, then you can push yourself a bit further. But if you're older and you've got a bunch of health conditions and injuries, then obviously you're not going to be running a marathon tomorrow, for the first time. You don't want to push yourself too far if you've got some vulnerability or frailty. And the same goes psychologically, particularly if you're prone to panic attacks, or you've got a diagnosable mental health condition, then you have to be extremely careful, and it might be inappropriate for you to visualize distressing or upsetting scenes. So that's a consideration that you have to weigh up. If you know that you have an existing psychological or emotional vulnerability, you've got to be cautious about that. Now, the other thing that's very important about this is the Stoics don't discuss this, so this is something that has to be emphasized. The amount of time that you expose yourself to a scene, but expose yourself just means like visualizing something that's upsetting. You confront it, how long you confront it for is the main variable. And so like a good question would be, people who have phobias, how come they haven't already overcome them? If it's that easy, if they just have to kind of sit it out until their anxiety wears off naturally. And there's a very simple, powerful answer to that, which is that generally speaking, like, you know, our little furry creature really wanted to get the food, so he was motivated to go back to that place. But if you don't have a motive to go back and confront a scene or a situation that's disturbing, you'll have a powerful urge to avoid it. A visceral, overwhelming urge. So that person that goes in the room full of cats, like, is going to want nothing more at that point than to get out of the cat room as quickly as possible. So people are highly motivated to, in whatever way, to avoid confrontation with things that stimulate anxiety. But that's exactly the thing that would be most beneficial for them. And normally the thing that swings it is having a parent or a therapist with somebody. So if it's a child that's anxious, often their parent will encourage them, like if they're anxious about dogs, their parent might encourage them to pet a dog and to reassure them it's safe. A therapist might encourage a client to remain in the room and sit with the anxiety. So often it's the presence of another person that encouraging someone that helps them to get past that initial aversion. But anxiety may take 5-10 minutes. This is why the recording is 15 minutes long. And it may, I would normally say also, if you've got to the end of it and your anxiety hasn't reduced, I would suggest that you listen to it again, like straight away. So in some instances, you might want to listen to that recording twice. So it's a 30-minute exercise. And one way of measuring it is you just use a rough subjective scale. You picture a scene and say from 0 to 100%, like, how would I rate my anxiety, just so you can kind of calibrate and say if your anxiety is 90%, you'd want it to go down to maybe a third or down to 20 or 30% of its original level, so that, you know, basically there's a substantial noticeable reduction in it before you stop doing the exercise. So if you have something that provokes 90% anxiety and you visualize it and your anxiety goes down by about 5%, you're probably not going to benefit that much from that. And it may even be that in some cases, it may even backfire and make you more anxious when you encounter the thing again in the future. So it's very important that you are patient. If you like, patience is the most important thing here. Like sitting it out for longer than you would normally feel like picturing the scene. So that one way of looking at it is that you want to train yourself to be bored with something that previously made you feel anxious. And, you know, that seems like a very simple concept, but it's obviously it goes against your nature, because when you're bored, you want to get up and go and do something else, but you want to go deeper into that boredom. So you really bore yourself with the thing that used to provoke anxiety. So it becomes a lasting, a conditioned sense of boredom, if you like, or just like a neutralization of the anxiety. We could talk about this all day, but I'm going to continue and say a little bit more. So that's the basic concept. Some examples. In addition to this habituation, I said there are maybe half a dozen other psychological processes that can kick in either spontaneously. We know from research, like really early research found this, really some of the coolest research in the history of psychotherapy. I'm going to mainly talk about one or two other processes that you could also introduce more deliberately. And the main one would be cognitive distancing, because that's a different mechanism from emotional habituation, and it's central to Stoicism. So the Stoics do kind of hint at this idea that if you picture upsetting scenes, they say poverty, exile, death, disease, stuff like that. You know, all those fun things, all the misfortunes that could befall you in life, they say regularly visualize them, and, you know, until you get used to dealing with them. They do kind of hint at, in some ways, this idea of natural abate, the feelings naturally abating over time. Plutarch, who's influenced by the Stoics but isn't a Stoic, explicitly refers to this idea that Aesop refers to, of the anxiety just wearing off. But the Stoics will tend to say that what they're going for is the separation of the value judgments from the external events. So rehearsing actually a strategic cognitive maneuver like that we call cognitive distancing. So when you're picturing this scene, so you might imagine getting sacked from your job, right? And practice like telling yourself it's not things that upset me, but my opinions about them. So practice noticing the way in which you're reacting to the scene, and that your values and your anger, frustration, or anxiety are being projected onto the scene, that they're separate from it, they're a reaction to it, and there's an arbitrariness about that, like that you could view it from a different perspective. You could invest less value in that scene, like the values are superimposed on it rather than being inherent properties of the scene itself. That's cognitive distancing, this idea about, realizing that you're looking through the world catastrophe tinted glasses, as it were, and you could put on a different set of glasses and look at it. So you could just tell yourself, it's not things that upset me, but my opinions about them, and meditate on the meaning of that phrase while you visualize the scene. That can interact with the natural process of emotional habituation. But you actually have two fundamental and very powerful psychological processes working in your favor here, although one of them will tend to happen spontaneously almost like 90% of the time or more, and the other one, the cognitive distancing, tends to be a bit more strategic. It requires you to make a little bit more effort to remind yourself to think of it in that way. And then I mentioned this other idea that obviously when you're visualizing a scene, in phobia treatment and stuff, we tend to think, like if you picture, if you say you've got I'm bored with the cat phobia now, actually, let's pick a different example. I've had clients in the past who were blood phobic, slightly different sort of problem in some ways, actually. I won't go into the peculiarities of that, like we'll just treat it as a phobia. And what would be a good example? Blood phobia might not be that big a problem for some people unless they have to have blood tests and stuff, and then it suddenly becomes like a big issue for them that they may have to deal with for practical purposes. Our public speaking anxiety is a little bit more complex, but that's another relatively simple type of anxiety. So let's say you're picturing that scene. Now you might just do it passively. So you might have a blood phobia and you picture just sitting there and having blood taken. Or public speaking, you might just, that's trickier, but you might just kind of imagine very simply standing in front of an audience or something like that until the anxiety wears off. But obviously, just for practical purposes, when you're visualizing any of these scenes, it's natural to think, what would I do in that situation? And especially if you're doing it repetitively, it's going to be hard not to imagine what you're going to do in that situation, what you might say in that situation, how you might act in that situation, how you might interact with other people, especially if it's something inherently interactive like social anxiety or public speaking anxiety. And that's where you can then bring in actually another theme that we've worked on, which is valued living. So you might imagine, in addition, I would say that you should do that later. I would say to begin with, just focus on cognitive distancing and waiting out the feelings long enough that they begin to wear off naturally. But then you might begin to picture changes in your behavior in the situation. I do that later. But when you're picturing changes in your behavior, you might imagine yourself doing public speaking and maybe performing more confidently or dealing better with setbacks. Like say you forget your place when, what's I saying? Oh yeah, dealing with mistakes that you make and stuff like that actually is a good strategy for overcoming public speaking anxiety. So imagine yourself dealing with a situation in accord with virtue, with self-discipline, courage, wisdom, or the values that you've identified earlier. So rehearsing changes in behaviour that are consistent with your core values is kind of like an add-on, but it also has very powerful therapeutic benefits. I've said a lot, haven't I? You can tell this is my kind of like hobby, or what used to be my specialism. Some more comments. What if I can't think of an upsetting situation? So the other variable that I haven't said that much about is what scene would you imagine? What if I can't think of an upsetting situation? The other thing that I should say is there's a thing called the generalization effect in exposure. So the easiest way for me to explain it, if you forgive me giving these weird examples, I've done them zillions of times, so I know that they help to clarify things. Imagine someone's got a dog phobia and they walk into therapy. And the therapist says, shut your eyes and imagine an Alsatian. Or let's look at some videos of Alsatians. And then the client habituates, the anxiety wears off. They go, I'm bored looking at Alsatians now. It doesn't really bother me anymore. And so would they then need to go through Chihuahuas, Poodles, Bull Mastiffs, like all the other breeds of dogs in order to overcome the dog phobia? Because you can only visualise really one breed of dog at a time properly. Like I guess you could try and picture loads and loads of them, but you know, so that's the question. That's the puzzling question, right? And the answer in a way should be kind of semi-obvious. You should think, I guess it's going to generalise to some extent. Like if I overcome my phobia by actually visualising an Alsatian or actually going to the park and being able to pet an Alsatian, then I'm probably going to feel less anxious about Labradors as well. But you might not. There might be another breed of dog that freaks you out a little bit. So there's some degree of generalisation, but that can be substantially increased by targeting several different related scenes. So you might only need to do Alsatians, or you might go Alsatians, Doberman Pinschers, you know, maybe one other breed. And that's after maybe 2, 3, 4 distinct examples, it's probably going to be enough to generalize right across the board. That you need to play that by ear a little bit. It's going to vary a bit from one person to another. But so there's natural generalization that happens from one concrete example to other related situations. But if you pick several different examples, you're much more likely to get generalization. And then that leads on to another point, which is if you overcome your fear of dogs, your fear of cats, your fear of heights, your fear of public speaking, you're going to gradually, like if you deal with a bunch of different things, your improvement is going to start to generalize to unrelated situations. And you're going to develop the holy grail of mental health, which we call a general emotional resilience. And so you can deliberately target that, which the Stoics were clearly doing. So the Stoics didn't say sit down and visualize dogs, right? They said imagine exile. Like our modern equivalent of exile, by the way, would be being in lockdown, perhaps, is a kind of like comparable in some ways, isn't it? Like being in lockdown and being isolated for a month or two is a little bit like being sent into exile, kind of cut off from people and kind of like confined and having to maybe, you know, make do in certain ways. So death, disease, poverty, you know, persecution, all these kind of things. The Stoics talk about picturing a whole range of different misfortunes. And, you know, we know now that if they did that, they'd be likely to develop general emotional resilience. They'd develop, you know, a sense of confidence and an ability to cope with a range of different stressful situations. So the audio recording helps you to do that. You know, like what did I say? If you can't think of an upsetting situation, you know, they can even be you can pick situations that you're actually going to encounter in life, or you can even pick fictional situations. I don't like the idea of I watched that film Gravity the other day, like being in a spaceship or a space station or whatever, and it gets hit by space debris. That looked pretty stressful with George Clooney and Sandra Bullock, but the chances of it ever happening to me are pretty negligible. unless they suddenly decide, unless NASA suddenly decide they're going to send Stoics into space, or space Stoics as well as cyber Stoics. But I'm never going to be in that situation. But having seen the movie, I could go away and imagine it, and it might make me feel anxious. So I could use it for exposure therapy. And you might think, what's the point of that, Donald? Because you're never going to be in the situation. The point is that I'm going to develop the cognitive skills. So I might find myself in I might be stuck in an elevator that breaks down one day and think I'm not really prepared for this. But actually I rehearsed myself of being stuck in a space station. And it's the same cognitive skills I'm using. So I might be prepared for situations that require similar skills, but despite the fact that they might appear quite different, right? So you could even use fictional situations from movies if you wanted to, as well as just common problems that befall other people. Although I have to say, today, in the middle of a pandemic and with the riots going on in America and stuff, it shouldn't be that hard to think of examples of stressful situations, right? You just need to turn on your television set these days. So the audio recording makes it real easy for you. It's going to guide you through that process. As long as you know all of the stuff I've just told you, it's going to be a piece of cake for you to use the audio recording. But do not use it, or be extremely careful, or do it under supervision if you're prone to panic attacks or have other psychological, diagnosable mental health problems. And don't pick scenes that you think are likely to be distressing or in an overwhelming way. I mean, to pick an obvious example, if someone's been a victim of traumatic assaults or sexual assaults in the past, that's probably something that's best done under the supervision of a clinical psychotherapist rather than using a self-help technique, right? But if you're anxious about delivering a wedding speech or something, then by all means, that's probably going to be a perfect candidate for this kind of exercise. So the recording's about 15 minutes long. Listen to it twice in a row if you have to. The daily meditation exercise then is to do the rapid, frequent thing. And then I give some guidance about how to remind yourself to do that, setting up cues. I think we discussed that in an earlier chapter a bit. I find that some people are good at doing this and other people aren't. But I'll tell you what I would do and what clients of mine have done in the past, and then you can either emulate that or not. If you really want to learn a psychological skill and you get it down so it just takes you a few seconds, and we'll come on to that in a moment, what the skill would be. To really train it, I would say tell yourself you're going to do it at least once every waking hour during the day. Say it's a skill that takes 30 seconds to do. Say my goal, whether I actually do it or not, fate permitting, would be once every hour to do this, over the next week or so. And set some app up on your phone if necessary to do that, a timer or something. And it's unlikely you're going to manage to do it every hour, but you can set that as an aspirational goal. If you manage to do it 8 times during the day, that's probably going to be pretty good going anyway. Or another thing that people do is they say, whenever I leave a room or whenever I begin a new activity or a conversation, I'm going to pause and do my little 30-second exercise before I continue. Every time you go to the loo or have a meal, it's just the trick is just to create a rule where you use a frequently occurring event as a cue for doing the exercise, and make the exercise so short it only takes maybe 30 seconds or even less. So you can do it many times throughout the day, and you get really good and fast at using the skill. Another thing would be to set up environmental cues. So put a post-it note in your fridge, or tie a bit of string around your finger, put your watch on the other wrist or something like that. And so each time you notice that, treat it as a cue to think, I'll do my, I've noticed that I've got my watch on the wrong wrist again. I'll just pause and do my exercise for 30 seconds. So the goal is to trick yourself into doing this as many times as possible each day, so that you learn to do it in a bunch of different situations, and it becomes a very ready to hand and accessible quick skill for you. So what is the skill? Well, actually you could practice any number of different skills in that way, but having done various mindfulness exercises, in the next page of the course it describes how to do a brief, rapid, frequent mindfulness exercise. So you're going to practice prosoche, becoming much more focused on your own thoughts for a moment, and in particular reminding yourself of the distinction between things that are up to us and things that are not. Having done the Benson method earlier, you could do that. So just voluntarily for 30 seconds, repeat a word, or just say the number 1 to yourself, and as you do it, really focus your attention on the aspects of that you're doing voluntarily, and the distinction between that and everything else, including automatic thoughts and feelings that enter your stream of consciousness. So do that like 30 seconds as many times a day as you can for a week, like to really kind of hone your skills and generalize them. As we said earlier, the self-monitoring is you're going to develop a very simple coping plan to help you think about maintaining your improvement over the longer term. There's a really clear example of that in the course, and that is everything that we cover in the final week of the course. And if you have any questions, you can ask those on Facebook or post them in the discussion area in the course online. We'll be checking in the group, and Tim and the volunteers, Tim LeBon, I didn't say hi to people this week, did I? We've got the 3 volunteers that are helping out. Mark, Jonathan and Chris, and Tim LeBon and the Modern Stoicism team is here helping. So we'll give you support, and other group members, if you post in the discussion area, will help you out as well. This is a really good opportunity because people are more experienced now. Never be stuck. If you're stuck, just tell everybody. If you're stuck, tell the other people in the discussion. And you'll usually find other people go, well, I had that problem as well, but this is how I overcame it. Because, part of this course, we're sneakily encouraging you to get better at troubleshooting and problem solving, and then using social learning so that, either you figured out how to deal with that yourself, or if you introduce it to the group, hopefully some of the other group members who have kind of got more proactive at solving problems and troubleshooting might chip in and give you some advice about that. And I think that's all that I have to say. This thing of exposure therapy is my hobby horse, and I could talk about it for hours and hours and hours, and I used to when I trained therapists. So I think that's everything that I need to say about it, though. Pretty much, really. I'll leave it at that. I think the key thing is the patience. Inherently, it can be a bit tedious to do, and so realize that there's going to be a natural tendency to break off the exercise prematurely, and so the biggest obstacle is just overcoming that and sitting it out for a bit longer, waiting it out a bit longer. Occasionally, you'll get people who say they aren't good at visualizing things. I don't believe them, because I think usually in my experience, clearly some people are better at visualizing than others. But the question I usually ask people is, do you never think of things that upset you then? Like when you're worrying about stuff, are you not thinking about things in a way that distresses you? Don't you remember events in the past and sometimes feel emotions about it? And if you do, then you're probably, that's all that you need to be able to do. Most people's mental images are fragmentary. People will tend to... There's research on this. It shows that when people visualize a complex scene, what they tend to do actually is focus on one aspect of it at a time, and their attention kind of jumps around, and so the whole image might lack clarity, but there's kind of, what they'll do is kind of have a sense of the whole and focus on different bits at different times. That's normal. I mean, basically, as long as you can feel any anxiety or anger, that's good enough for the exposure therapy to work, right? All you really have to do is evoke the feeling in order to habituate. So don't worry about... Very, very few people have photorealistic mental images. Normally, clients with public speaking anxiety often worry about this because they tend to set unrealistically high standards. So do depressed clients, actually. They're often kind of perfectionistic about it. So it's more a problem of perfectionism rather than an issue about the images being clear enough. Or there's other things you could do, like I say, watching videos while you're listening to the audio recording. That might work for some people. It varies a lot depending on what the nature of your anxiety is and what it is that you want to habituate to. I better check in actually in the comments and stuff. I haven't been following it closely. I hope you found that interesting, and please remember to complete the questionnaire. Like I said, the data from that's very valuable to us. We're going to be sending out the link to that shortly. We'll send it by email, and also I think after the end of the course there's a little add-on extra stage that will be released with some, information about additional resources online, and you'll get a notification of that. So, okay, that's us. Thank you once again for tuning in and listening to me, and I look forward to hearing from you all in the future, and I wish you good luck with week 4 of the course. So it's goodbye from me once again here in Nova Scotia. Bye everybody. Bye bye.